Hey, Cass, do you want to do drugs?
I mean, that depends. Are we talking smokable, injectable,
No, no, no,
ingestible?
no. I mean for the podcast topic today.
Oh, well, I guess that's less fun, but yeah, we can talk about that.
All right. So I think a good place to start would probably be defining what a drug is, because if we can't define what a drug is, then there's really no way that we can effectively talk about it. So I think using the FDA definition, is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So I have it pulled up. The FDA, which is in the United States Food and Drug Administration, a drug is officially defined as one, a substance recognized by an official pharmacopoeia or formulary. Two, a substance intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. Three, a substance other than food intended to affect the structure or any function of the body. Four, a substance intended for use as a component of a medicine, but not a device or a component, part, or accessory of a device. And biological products are included within that definition. And to be quite honest, I think that's a piss poor definition of a drug because technically speaking, bullets are classified as a drug in that case, minus the being accepted by a pharmacopoeia or formulary, but that's an arbitrary definition that has nothing to do with the substance itself. A
Hmm.
bullet is made out of lead, which is a substance. It can be used to cure diseases, particularly terminal diseases, where if you want to die anyway, it can be used to treat that by ending your life. A substance other than food intended to affect the structure or function of the body. Yep, bullet
Hmm.
meets that. And a substance intended for use as a component of medicine, but not a component of not a part of the device.
So the first couple of things there, I mean, speaking of a bullet, would a bullet itself be the drug, or would lead be the drug? Because lead is definitely
I
can be a drug
Well, you can
considered.
take drugs in many forms, and
Yeah, exactly.
I
This
would
this
say
is
that
just a very violent way.
sure, lead would be the drug, and one of the possible methods of injection would be a gun.
Yeah, I mean, it has been proposed in internet circles of coating bullets with medicine to deliver that much faster. So
And besides the death by rapid onset of lead poisoning, lead poisoning is another way that you can die, and that's something that when
yeah.
people are interacting with lead, they can die from lead in other ways. So lead itself
Hmm.
is a substance that has intoxicating effects to various degrees, and
Yeah.
one of those ways of ingesting lead very quickly is a bullet. So I think by the
Yeah.
official FDA
So,
definition, lead and therefore bullets would classify as a drug. Would you
well,
agree with that?
seeing as lead has been used as an artificial sweetener in the past, primarily by the Romans, would it not be considered a food?
Actually, I think that's a very good point. That the Romans used to use lead plates and lead cutlery for the purpose of adding a slight sweet flavor to their food. So
Hmm.
in that case, it's not food. You're not actually eating. Well, you are ingesting lead, but you're not eating it
Hmm.
for the purpose of sustenance. So it's not a food, and it was intentionally used for sensational purposes. So
So, speaking about like that, I mean, this might be a tangent, but I mean, lead was like the world's first artificial sweetener, um, or in many one of the first. Uh, so, do things like artificial sweeteners, things that don't have any caloric value and don't add anything like water or any vitamins or anything like that to it, does it is sucralose a drug because it isn't a food? By this definition, it seems like it would be.
and I think I would agree with that. That the portion of the definition other than food, well, what do they mean by food? My guess is what they mean by food is something that has caloric value that you ingest
Hmm.
for the purpose of maintaining energy.
Yep.
And anything with calories could be considered a food, whereas anything without calories for the purpose of altering structure, which is a very vague definition, would probably be classified as a drug, which means that sucralose, I would think, yes, would be classified as a drug, as would equally lead.
Hmm. Yeah.
So,
That's true. I
so
just wouldn't go so far as to say a bullet is, but more so the substance the bullet made out of is made out of is the drug. and
It,
it's
it
usually
is the
lead.
drug, but the application could also be used in the form for curing certain diseases. I mean, or at least
Yeah.
ending the life of that disease. It'll also end the life of the person that is being shot. But
I mean,
it fits multiple parts of the definition, as well as lead itself being a sweetener.
if you target the shot well enough, I mean, that's like, there's a
Depending on the bullet,
reason.
if there's a growth on your
Yeah.
hand or something, you can blow off your hand and still
Well,
survive.
not even that. Like, think of just shrinking the bullet down to be much smaller and speeding it up a lot faster, and then targeting that to a cancerous
Sure.
tumor to just destroy the tumor.
I
Hey,
mean
that's real medicine.
that's what particle accelerators do.
Exactly. And
For
a lot
a
of
method
particle,
of a method of cancer treatment is
yeah.
taking small particles, accelerating them up in a particle accelerator,
Hmm.
and that's very pinpoint method of radiation treatment. So it's not exactly a gun because it doesn't use gunpowder, but you are accelerating
Well,
particles into the body.
yeah, we won't get into the definition of guns. I think drugs is enough topic of one day.
I think
Drugs
so.
and
I think
guns
so.
just seems like going a bit further. But
But
yeah,
but
so this
I think we
definition
seem to agree that
is,
this definition is insufficiently broad.
yeah, I
So
do like parts of it.
that
Like,
it's not for sustenance, that it doesn't provide energy.
correct.
And I like that
Exactly.
as
It's
well.
something not for sustenance. It's something that, and it covers the pharmaceutical definition of a drug, something intended for use in diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. I like that. The thing that I think this is primarily missing is um, something along the lines of something that will have, like, taking a drug is in many regards, like, colloquially speaking, when you're on the street and you're looking for drugs, you're not thinking about what you get at a pharmacy. Well, I guess some people are these days, unfortunately, but when you're looking for something like weed, or you're looking for something like heroin, you're looking for something that's going to have a mind altering effect on you in
Or
either the
body
short or
altering
the long
effect.
term, or body altering, and sometimes like steroids, for example. Um, so there has to be some distinction there about, this is something that is like, the statement about intended to affect the structure or function of the body is way too broad.
And I agree with that because food very much falls into that, and they kind of shoved in the besides food that it was in
Hmm.
parentheses in one of the sub definitions of what a drug is besides food, but that doesn't even make sense either because uh, shrooms, magic
Yeah,
mushrooms, you can eat those
definitely.
for caloric
Yeah.
value, and some of them happen to
You.
also have chemicals in them. I mean, yeah, they aren't high
Yeah.
in caloric value, but you can add them for flavoring. There are calories
Um,
associated with them,
yeah.
and some of them have mind altering effects. So
Yeah.
food can have drugs in them.
Yep.
Coffee
And
beans
I
also
will
have
I
yeah, go ahead.
will state, just for the audience's purpose, that I know you I guess know a lot of different things. I will say that I definitely know I have more experience firsthand with drugs. So I've been all over the world, and I've had a lot of different experiences in different countries. I mean, looking at Amsterdam, I've done shrooms, I've smoked weed there. I had been all over, so I have a decent amount of experience with a lot of different drugs, whether this be something that I've done myself, or that um, close friends of mine have unfortunately become addicted to in the United States. And so I'm not sure how much firsthand experience is going to come up in this conversation later on, but I do like to make the distinction that I have that experience, and it's there. So my perception of things may be different than yours, as someone
Sure,
who has less experience with those, that illegal, or in the
sure,
U.S. what would be considered illegal side of
sure.
things.
And I think that let's start with a drug that most people do have experience with, which would be caffeine.
Yeah.
Caffeine is not regulated, but or
Hmm.
at least not yet. It is addictive. If you have a lot of caffeine all the time and then you stop taking caffeine, you get caffeine headaches. That's a withdrawal
Yeah.
symptom.
Yep.
It has a dependency. It does alter your mind. A lot of times it alters your body and making you jittery if you have too much of it. You can technically overdose. It's very rare because of how much you need. I think it's equivalent to basically chugging around 90 cups of coffee.
Yeah.
It's a very large amount, but when you have caffeine powder, if you eat that because you really want to be energetic, you can end up overdosing and kill yourself with caffeine. So it is
Yeah.
lethal. You can overdose. It is mind altering. It's body altering, but it's not illegal. And
Hmm.
that's something that most people have experience with. Alcohol
Yeah.
is also a good example of a drug because it's very mind altering. That changes your ability to value risk. It lowers your inhibitions. It's one of the reasons that people usually are more likely to have sex while they're drunk, is because your inhibitions have been inhibited. Ironic, inhibiting inhibitions.
Yep.
So caffeine, I think, is a drug. I think we would classify that as a drug. And I think
Oh,
at this point
definitely.
we should be building up the definition of what we consider to be a drug. Are
Yep.
shrooms a drug? Because they do have
Um,
caloric value.
I would say yes, because I I I I think that there are plenty of foods out there that will, when eaten in quantity, will provide that mind or body altering state that we both agreed on should be
So
part of this definition.
I think
So
I
I,
think that it's an important starting point, but
mhm,
if we say it alters your mind or mental state and it alters your state of body, food meets that requirement.
yeah,
And
and that's why what I'm trying to get across here though is that there isn't such a hard line between what is food and what is drugs because
right.
thinking about eucalyptus when it comes to koalas, eucalyptus actually makes koalas high when they're eating it, and it has low caloric
Mhm.
value. But the reason that they primarily eat it is because one, I mean, it has enough caloric value, but it also gets them high. So what's eucalyptus? Is it food or is it a drug?
Sure. And what is it that's making the person feel high or making the entity feel high? Because animals
Hmm.
eat particular types of fruit and let it ferment in their stomach, particularly to get drunk. If you want to watch some really funny videos, look up drunk elephant, and it's pretty entertaining. Or drunk squirrels. But bringing it back to humans, I think that food in itself is a form of drug because I don't know if you've been around someone that's really hungry, but there are withdrawal symptoms. People very frequently get hangry, hungry, angry.
Hmm.
And as soon as you eat, a lot of times you have a euphoric feeling. You know, the first time that you
Yeah.
take a bite that you haven't eaten in 12 hours, there's that expression of some sort of euphoric feeling when you do start eating. After you eat, a lot of times you're in a different mental state. You're no longer thinking about hunger. And a lot of times you're more alert after you eat. That's one of the reasons that it's suggested to eat breakfast first thing in the morning, is because it makes you more alert. So it affects your mental state and it affects your physical state.
Hmm.
And it's a body response to what is being ingested. Now, it responds that way because of the caloric value. And I think that that's where we should draw the distinction that a drug is something that is a chemical component of something that does not have caloric value, but when ingested alone, that will affect your mental or physical state.
Yeah.
THC
THC
is a good
is,
example
yeah,
of that.
yeah, where like the actual cannabis plant has caloric value.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not entirely sure if it's at all digestible by humans, but
Mushrooms
there
would be.
is
Mushrooms have caloric
mushroom.
value,
Yeah,
but you can extract out the chemical that will affect your
yeah,
brain.
psilocybin is that chemical.
Right. So
And if you pull out just the psilocybin, which is done, um, then you have no caloric intake, but you're getting the drug there. The I mean, the interesting thing about mushrooms, though, as someone that has had them, uh, you ingest them and your body immediately wants to get rid of them because it knows almost immediately that that's essentially poison that's being put into your body.
mhm.
So it is for all you listeners out there that may ever have the chance, which I would say do it
let's
if it's
let
legal, but um, you're supposed to eat when you take mushrooms, you eat it with another food so that your body doesn't quite recognize right away that there is this poison in the middle of everything else.
I
um,
also want to jump in and say we are not making any recommendations on
that's
whether
fair.
or not to do something, and
I'm just
we can't control what people
yeah.
do. But if you do something, it should be legal. Make sure it's
Hmm.
safe. And don't do anything that you don't trust yourself or others with. So
Yep.
let's not be making recommendations, but
Yeah, I'm
also
not
not
going to
recommending
recommend someone
against
try them.
anything.
Yeah, all
We're
I'm saying is that that is the standardly recognized way of making your body actually keep the psilocybin and shrooms inside of you long enough to absorb it.
All right.
So that is.
But I don't think that bodily rejection is something that should come into whether or
Yeah.
not it's a drug, because you can smoke THC and that won't be rejected by the body. So
Yeah.
I don't think that bodily rejection is something that would include or exclude anything that would be considered a drug.
That's fair enough. I agree. I mean, a lot of drugs cause. You think about a drug. Hey, what about a drug that is meant to cause you to vomit?
Right.
That's
What Epicac.
yeah. Okay.
Epicac is a great example of that, where the whole intention is to make your body reject it and everything else that's in your stomach. Laxatives are another good example of that, and it's
Just the opposite direction.
right. So I think that really our definition of drug kind of boils down to it cannot have caloric value, and it has to have mind-altering or body-altering effects, again, without the caloric value. And that can include taste sensation, that is a section of the mind, and or at least your interpretation of it is a section of the mind. So I think that things that taste good but don't have calories are technically then a drug. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so.
In which case, lead is a drug. So what?
Yeah.
I guess while we've come up with a different definition that also includes lead and bullets, I think it's I like the specificity of this.
Yeah.
Are we happy with it? Because I think that excludes all food. It includes all medical drugs and pharmaceutical drugs in terms of fighting disease. Because if you're, for instance, if you're just trying to treat cancer with chemo, it does not have caloric value, and it does change the structure or the ability of your body to function. So I think that encompasses everything, both medical and recreational. Agreed?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so now that we have a definition for drugs, let's move forward on the ethics around drugs.
So yeah, one question I'll ask you, as someone that I mean, for the most part, I'll say that in terms of illegal drugs and many legal ones, why are drugs bad? What?
I think let's start off with that. More accurately, are drugs bad or are drugs good?
Yeah.
I would contend that drugs are good because they work. Like you don't do drugs because they're ineffective. Drugs are effective, and that's what makes people want them. That's what makes them effective.
Because they're meeting their intended purpose, they are inherently good from a purely logic standpoint.
They are inherently useful.
Yeah.
So I was using the term good as in useful.
Yeah. Yep.
So
they accomplish what they are trying to do, sometimes with extra side effects.
Sure, and they don't necessarily try to accomplish something, but caffeine is a good example. That caffeine isn't necessarily good or bad inherently, but it is useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, heroin used to be used as a medicine quite commonly. It's like It's a good pain reliever.
And so is THC.
Yeah, it has the side effects are the things. I think when people think about the whether something in terms of a drug is good or bad, you need to weigh it between medical,
the negative effects,
the positive effects and the negative effects, and then also like if you aren't the one making that distinction between the two, then there's someone at some point, and in some cases, those negative effects that they're listing are complete BS and racist bullshit. Yep. One of the first arguments against cannabis in the United States was that they said it would make white women fall in love with black men.
And regardless of whether, I mean, there is a possibility that that claim could have been true. But regardless of that, making the claim doesn't make it true. There should be research into what the negative effects are. And if there are actually negative effects, then we should take that into account. But just saying this drug has a negative effect is, I don't think, enough to outlaw it. So I think
Correct.
That's a good example of how ideologies can be abused to interfere with drug use. And
yeah, and so that's why I'm not saying that if something it has negative side effects, that it should immediately be illegal.
Mm-hmm.
But all I'm saying is that there needs to be some conscious decision there, or there should be some conscious decision about, these are the positive effects of this, these are the negative ones. Is it worth it? Something that, like, if there's a
I
new
agree.
cancer treatment suddenly found, and someone dying of cancer and they're going to die tomorrow takes this medication, that it's going to cure their cancer as a positive effect, but it might cause them to die right now. I mean, death is a pretty serious side effect, but is it worth it if
Right.
there's a chance?
I think another thing that you have to take into account is the person's decision. Of if the
Mm-hmm.
person knows what the side effects are and they still choose to use that drug, they are actively engaging with those negative side effects as they see fit. And
Yeah.
just riding a motorcycle has a lot of negative risk. Crashing on a motorcycle can be very, very dangerous and lethal.
Yep.
Doing certain types of drugs wrong and overdosing can also be lethal. But we leave that up to the individual to make those decisions. And I think that drugs should be similar. That if you can regulate drugs to the point where people are educated on what those risks and negative side effects are, that it should be regulated similar to any other dangerous activities.
Yeah. So, I mean, that begs the question of what do you mean by, when you say regulation? Do you mean making things illegal, or just making things so that there is some control on the market, such that it can't get out of, I mean, so that it doesn't go out of control, so it doesn't
It's
turn into a,
it's a good question, and I think let's start with illegality of certain types of drugs, because some drugs throughout most countries are illegal. I think that cocaine is probably a good example that is illegal in many countries right now. Would you agree with
yeah.
that?
Yeah. Many countries, cocaine is definitely illegal. I mean,
Right. Why is it illegal? So, there's obviously a reason that a lot of countries have agreed to make certain types of drugs illegal. So before we discount that, why has it been made illegal?
that's a good question that I don't know the real answer for, but I think we can
Let's
talk through it
speculate.
and
Let's
try to
speculate.
speculate why. I mean, it increases the chance of heart problems, because it rapidly increases your heart rate. It causes, I believe,
So
it causes an effect
basically,
on.
there's risk to the person who's taking it. There's a risk to their health, overall health and
Yeah.
well-being. Okay.
Yep.
I think
And I think it also has the effect of lowering inhibitions to an extent, like
similar to
when you're,
alcohol.
yeah.
And I think that one of the primary reasons that cocaine is prohibited in a lot of places is because it can have a very negative effect on your personality, can make you more aggressive towards people, and it increases the likelihood of you acting more aggressively towards people. So does alcohol, but alcohol is also a depressant, whereas cocaine is a stimulant.
Definitely an upper.
Right. So if both cocaine and alcohol lower your inhibitions, making you more likely to potentially act violently towards people, but alcohol is a depressant, making you less likely to act on those, cocaine is a stimulant, making you more likely to act on those. So with cocaine, you are significantly more likely than during your standard state or even in a drunken state to act aggressively against other people. And I think that, that's probably where the illegality comes from, is that you are more likely to affect other people. That's also why alcohol is regulated, because that inhibition lowering effect changes how you act around others and towards others. It also makes you significantly more dangerous while driving, which is why drunk driving is illegal. Is that illegal? I guess I can't say everywhere, but drunk driving
everywhere in the U.S. It's generally, I mean, in any, I would expect that in any country with a stable
most first
governmental
world
system,
countries probably
yeah,
outlaw drinking and driving, because it's known to be incredibly dangerous, not towards you, or not just towards you, but towards others. And studies have been done over lethality of drinking and driving crashes, and the person that was drunk is more likely to survive the crash than the people that they hit, because if your muscles are loose, you're less likely to resist the forces that are involved in a crash. And so you're more likely to, I guess, go with the flow of the crash, meaning that your injuries are less severe. So you are more likely to kill someone else than you are to kill you. That's one of the reasons that drinking and driving particularly is more regulated than drinking itself. Cocaine is makes it more likely for you to affect another person's life, and that's why at least I think that's why it's more regulated than other drugs. So then the question becomes, why are other drugs that don't have that effect also regulated? For instance, THC or pot. Why is that illegal when if you're stoned, you're not likely to do anything to anyone else or anything to yourself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and unlike alcohol, for example, THC, you can't really overdose on it. It serves a different purpose, and you end up just being more chill for the most part. I mean, you should definitely not get behind the wheel, and like that's why I mean, when I was growing up, it was always what was it? Not OWI.
Operating while intoxicated.
DUI was
driving under the influence.
Yeah, driving under the influence. I'm trying to think of the one that had like
it doesn't matter that it's separated from drinking and driving.
Yeah, and it's like driving under the influence, operating while intoxicated. Those are more general statements than drunk driving, because drunk only covers alcohol.
Sure. Sorry, go ahead.
So, I mean, people listening, don't do anything that would be considered DUI or OWI where you are.
Whatever you do, don't put anyone else's lives at risk.
Right.
Or their well-being. So I think that's one definition of when the government may want to step in, or when a governing agency should probably step in, is when you increase the risk to others by taking a certain drug. Now, THC is also outlawed in a lot of locations in the United States, and it's still federally forbidden at the time of recording this video. And I think that is possibly more of an ideological one, that drugs themselves are currently, since they're illegal, if people get them, they have to be associated with those illegal acts. So, we can't legalize it because it's associated with illegal activity. And I think beyond that, and originally with the war on drugs from the late 1900s, the reason behind that, I think, was more of looking at even simple drugs like THC as a gateway drug to those more intense drugs like cocaine that would end up having you affect people.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to get too much into the Reagan administration here, but the war on drugs...
The war on drugs came at a time when
the U.S. is not winning and has never been winning the war on drugs. There is no way to win it.
and I agree with that, but I don't think that it was done out of malice. And I think that what some people may attribute malice of, Reagan just resented the people that used drugs. And I don't think that that's a fair analysis. My interpretation is that the policies against drugs and trying to eliminate drugs or reduce drug use was not to attack a particular group of people. It was to try and protect people from each other while also preventing people from suffering from addiction and the negative side effects thereof. It's an ideological difference, but I don't think that it was done. Have you ever heard
about the 100 to 1 ruling? Like the ruling about 100 to 1?
I don't believe so. Go ahead.
About cocaine.
No, go ahead.
So there are the two main forms of cocaine are powder and crack cocaine. They are the same drug. Crack cocaine is smoked. It's been combined with baking soda and something else. I can't remember what. Whereas powder cocaine is snorted, and powder cocaine needs to be more pure for the snorting, whereas crack cocaine is, I guess, the unrefined form in many cases.
It's melted and injected, right?
Or smoked. Okay. Just smoked, really. You get a crack pipe and you smoke it. So the ruling in the initial war on drugs, and I think it's still the case, I don't think it was ever overturned, is that the sentencing for someone found with a certain amount of crack cocaine on them was 100 times that of the same amount of powder cocaine found on them. And the primary claims for why this happened. And I mean, I was not around at
Yeah.
the time, and I was not part of the administration making the decisions, but crack cocaine is primarily used by those lower in lower like
Tiers of
economical
society.
brackets,
Sure.
and primarily by non-white people. And whereas powder cocaine was used by a lot of high-class businessmen, government officials, people in those higher up roles that needed that extra little kick of energy to make it through that stuff. And I mean, they to get through their day.
The,
So that is the
while what you're
claim.
saying is that while the two forms of the drug were different, they were the same exact drug, just in
Mhm.
taken in different ways,
Yeah.
and on
And one
average,
was easier for poor people to take, whereas the other was for more rich people. Is
mhm.
essentially what it comes down to.
do do you think that it would be accurate to say that increasing the penalty would make it less likely for people to go around the law, to skirt the law?
No, that's not what I'm trying to get at this point. I do want to discuss that. But what
And
I'm trying to get
go
at
ahead.
here is your statement that the war on drugs did not have any malice behind it. And I'm trying to tell you that it did. And this 100-to-1 policy is a clear example of that. Why make the same drug? Why make sentencing for the same drug in one situation, specifically a situation more commonly by poor people, so much worse than if in the form that rich people normally take?
I think, and again, I also was not around at the time when this was a thing. So everything that you and I are both talking about is looking back on history. Um, a reason that I can at least come up with for why a particular group may have actually been targeted by this type of asymmetrical sentencing is based on where the problem was. That if you are in a very poor community and drugs are sweeping through that community and very prevalent there and having a negative effect on the population, whereas you have a rich location that the same drug is used but not as destructively, or it isn't interfering with the function of society as much, does the sentencing need to be equal if the effect that you're trying to combat is not equal? Because what you're talking about is, and when this was implemented, I believe, was during the crack epidemic, which was ravaging the black population. So they were more affected by it than the upper white classes of society. I'm not saying that that's a justification of it or that it's a good justification of it. I'm saying that that's probably an interpretation that was used when deciding on it, is that the sentence needs to match more of the intended consequences that you want to get out of it and the size of the problem. That the size of the problem was larger in the poorer communities rather than the rich communities, which is why the sentence was harsher, to give a larger incentive to the people that it was actually being problematic towards.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that it was right or wrong. I'm saying that that's a possible interpretation of it.
Yeah, and that's I'll say that's like the I mean, a lot of times this argument is brought up and said this was racist. It was because they were black and that's what's happening. But
if that was the motivation, that's wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm not. I just want to be clear that I'm not making a case for, oh well, some races should be more heavily penalized. No, that is wrong. People should be treated equally, but there are potential justifications for having asymmetrical sentences for particular types of drugs.
Yeah. There are arguments in either way, and I think that's part of the idea of this podcast is that we explore both sides.
Right.
And like there are a lot of people that say this was racist. There are other people that say no, this was because that was where the problem was, and it just happens to coincide with race. And I don't want to get into the racial history of America and why there is such a gap between those, because that's a great conversation, just not for right now.
So let's talk about crack specifically, let's talk about that in a modern context, because crack is now much more affecting the white community than it is the black community. So if new crack laws are implemented that increase sentencing right now, that will disproportionately affect the white population. Is that necessarily a racist policy? Can you enact a policy based on the drug use and have it, if it disproportionately affects one race or group than another, does that make it racist or hateful against that group?
So,
and let me add the clarification that I'm talking about powdered cocaine. So it tends to come up in richer communities, and it's becoming a problem for them as well. But
and that's why I think that helps fight the argument that says the issue was in the poorer communities because they were the ones using mostly crack cocaine, and therefore we should make that a lot worse because it's like the drug is the drug. Whether you ingest it in one form or another, you're getting the same drug. And just because one variety of it has disproportionately affecting things right now, does it make the other variety of it safer? If we were to replace what's the same amount of crack cocaine with an equivalent dosage of powder cocaine, would the same issues happen? Well, I mean, it's the same drug. So just because when the laws were written back in the 80s, crack cocaine was the bigger concern, should they have turned a blind eye to powder cocaine, especially knowing now that the powder cocaine epidemic, I don't know if that's the terminology that's used here, but affecting that it's causing bad social
laws may expire in their usefulness because the use cases for drugs change over time.
Yeah.
And so the penalties may need to move with those use cases.
Yeah. I want to make just a term definition here because I know that this term is, depending on where you are in the world, it's used differently. I'm probably going to say the term antisocial several times. I am not meaning the American general colloquial definition of not being a social person. I am meaning if you are being antisocial, you are acting against society. So being antisocial examples are...
Can you just say anti-societal?
I guess, but sure. I'm more used to the term antisocial, so it may come out. And I just wanted to make that distinction because I don't want people to think like someone's in their basement and playing video games by themselves. They're not working against society in most people's definition of the word.
Sure.
So graffiti, drug use that is inhibiting your ability to contribute to society or actively hurting
is antisocial behavior.
Is antisocial behavior.
Because you are preventing yourself from being able to contribute to society.
Yeah. And I mean, there are times no single person is expected to, nor should they always be contributing to society. Everyone needs
and it's not a mandate,
break.
or at least depending on the culture, it shouldn't be considered a mandate as long as you're not a drain on the society.
So a drain, I don't know if I want to say that. I want to say actively working against society is antisocial, whereas, I mean, being for society or being someone more neutral to society, or being a drain but not by choice, that is not antisocial. It is actively working against society. So do we I forget where this conversation started.
Right. And I was just to bring it back in. So we were talking about disproportionate effects on different populations based on their use cases. And I was making the argument that if a certain population is more affected by a particular type of drug, it may be beneficial to have a different effect or a different penalty based on the use case of the drug to combat specific areas where it is problematic rather than where it isn't problematic. But I think if we bring it back even further, what we're talking about is what is a fair punishment for drugs? And originally the question that we were asking is, should drug use be penalized? And let's focus on that question: is when should drug use be penalized?
My opinion is that it shouldn't. Drug use on its own should not be penalized. drug use that then, like, if you take a drug or you
Mm-hmm.
like drinking alcohol, you smoke weed, or you do heroin, and then you get behind the wheel of a car and you're putting other people in society at risk, or just generally being antisocial,
Mm-hmm.
that is what should be penalized, not the act of doing it on your own time in a safe manner.
Sure. So,
Um,
and I just want to interject here that some people are against drugs and think that the
mhm.
drug use itself should be penalized because you're altering your mind with a chemical that would not otherwise be, I guess, considered natural. Sometimes it's, artificially processed, but regardless of that, you're changing your state of mind, which some people are religiously or ethically against.
Yeah,
But
but
that,
where do they draw the line? I I've never heard a group of people, one of those groups of people, say down with caffeine because, hey, that's a useful drug.
right. And I think a lot of times those differences and dislikes of particular types of drugs are dislikes for particular lifestyles that
Mhm.
utilize those drugs. So I think that when people are angry about particular drugs or a particular group of people that do drugs, it's generally a distaste for the lifestyle that is associated with most people that do that particular drug. And I think
Yeah,
that that is not a reason to make a law against a particular drug. If
sure.
you don't
I agree with
if
that.
you don't like the weed smoking culture, that isn't a reason to stop them from smoking a weed. At least it doesn't affect you, and
Hmm.
it, to the it could affect you to an extent of they have a particular culture, and as that culture becomes more prevalent throughout society, then it may start to affect you. But as long as those people are not affecting you directly, it's their own business.
Yeah,
And so
like
that that's what
having
I
an
mean by
effect
an
towards societal
ideological basis.
change is one thing. Having an effect against someone's way of life is a different thing.
Yes, and I think that
Yeah.
outlawing particular drugs has been pushed more on an ideological lifestyle basis rather than
Hmm.
the actual effect of the drugs. And I think that
And
I would say that that's wrong because you are trying
I
to
agree.
exert control over another person's lifestyle
Mhm.
through this gateway drug, as I'll call it.
Yeah. And I mean, the last 40 years of the US criminalization of so many different drugs has proven that when you criminalize a drug, you don't stop its use. It
You
either
you
the
criminalize the
use,
use.
yeah, you either have um, you've criminalized it. So people that are potentially addicted and maybe even want to stop are afraid to admit it because they can't go get the help that they need without the question being asked or someone like bringing
Absolutely.
up to the authorities.
Absolutely.
And
You make it more difficult to recover from the drug or ask for help
yeah,
because if it's you would be admitting to a criminal activity.
yeah. And it also pushes the supply chain of a drug from something that might be like, a little bit shady, a gray area, to something that is immediately needs to be run by some sort of criminal empire
Hmm.
for that. And so
You
by
have to
making it
associate
illegal,
in order to get illegal drugs, you have to associate yourself with someone who is de facto a criminal,
yep,
and you have to associate yourself with people who are okay with subverting the law. Frequently, that means that they don't like the government in general and will likely be breaking other laws at the same time. So you're associating yourself with people that you otherwise wouldn't in order to get the
yeah,
drugs that shouldn't otherwise be illegal because it's more of a
yep,
cultural thing rather than a risk to others thing.
yeah. And I'm like, exactly. So it's not my personal opinion, and I think you may agree with this on some certain points, but the usage of drugs should never be illegal. The selling of unregulated drugs in any sort should be illegal. And I do
So
like I mean, and not maybe not in
I
any
think I
sort,
know
but
where you're going with the sense that
yeah,
uh, selling of drugs because it's ingested should probably be regulated similarly to how we regulate food. That you
yeah,
can't sell on a mass scale food without certain permits from the FDA to make sure that you're,
hmm,
well, two things. Number one, keeping it in safe conditions. So you're
yeah,
not letting it rot or putting it in places where rats may get to it and end up adding diseases to it. And also, number two, more importantly, the fact that you're selling what you're actually claiming to sell. It is highly
yep,
illegal to sell beef and replace it with pork, but still sell it as beef. It's
Yeah.
incredibly illegal, and you can get into a lot
Yeah.
of trouble for doing that. And drugs would be the same thing. If you can regulate them, you can make sure that what is being sold is actually
Exactly.
being sold. And this is a problem in the community that does use illegal drugs
Yeah.
because
Because there's no way, there's no one regulating what's going on there. You don't know the,
you
what
don't know what you're
your
getting.
cocaine might have been like laced with or mixed with
And
or cut with.
a lot of times dealers may add additives that make it
Hmm.
more addicting or
Yeah.
more effective the first couple hits that you get, so that you're more likely to come get more.
Yeah. You keep chasing the dragon. I mean, there are, I've definitely heard stories of people like trying to get weed and finding that it's laced with dabs, which has a similar but stronger effect than standard weed. And I don't actually know what dabs are made out of, but I do know that I,
When
I
it's
know people that, yeah.
unregulated, it's more likely that, or if there's no sort of verification that you can go to if you wish to, then it's
Mhm,
more difficult to verify what you're getting. If
exactly.
you have the choice between, so let's say peppers as an example, because peppers are not super calorically dense, but if you can grow peppers at home, you can maybe
Hmm.
sell them to your friends. I could also go to the grocery store and get peppers. Honestly, I'm
Yeah.
probably just going to go to the grocery store because they're readily available. I know what I'm getting. It has been vetted by various health institutions, and they are somewhat responsible for the peppers that I'm being sold.
Yeah.
If I buy them from my friend, it's like, did they keep it clean? I don't know. If I
I
don't
could
care, if I'm
probably
okay
trust
with,
them, a little bit. Does it look all right?
but sure, but it's up to me to make that decision. And with drugs, you don't get that decision when it's illegal. I can't say,
Yeah.
I'd rather purchase it from a store because there's vetting there.
Hmm.
And if they were made legal, then you would have the choice. You would still be able to get it from your friend in an unregulated way, but that friend would have less of an intention or less of a incentive to lace it with something, because if it ends up being bad, I can just go somewhere else to get it.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. The removal of regulation really hurts when it comes to any sort of, I mean, drugs, food and drugs. I mean, hey, we have the Food and Drug Administration for a reason in
Mm-hmm.
the United States.
Yes.
It is meant to regulate those things, and when you make the even just the like possession of any sort of a drug illegal,
Mm-hmm.
it prevents the FDA from doing any sort of regulation on any step of the entire process
Yes.
there, and that causes a lot of
And
harm overall.
there are two battles that you can fight. You can fight the battle against, I don't want, you can say, I don't want anyone to use any drugs whatsoever. Or you can take the battle of, people are going to use drugs. I want to make sure they use them safely. And I think the war
Mhm.
on drugs was saying no one should use drugs. And that's an
Yeah,
unwinnable battle because people will always find a new drug that ends up changing, like altering their mind or altering their body. People will find drugs and find ways of getting drugs because they're highly addictive. They're going to find a way to work around it. So I
hmm,
think that that's an unwinnable battle.
yeah,
Forcing people to be safe or safer is a battle that you can partially win. You can at least take steps to make it safer to do drugs and make it less likely that someone will negatively affect another person or themselves, and get
yeah,
help for it when they do have problems.
yeah,
So it's a more winnable battle. Fighting against any use of drugs, you cannot win. You can somewhat reduce it, but it's not a winnable fight. Whereas making
yeah,
it safer is something that you can partially win, and the more you fight, you will be more effective in making it safer, as opposed to trying to eliminate it. The more you try to eliminate it, the more illegal of areas people have to go to get those, meaning that you'll increase the damage that's done because of people going to increasingly criminalized societies or criminal groups.
hmm,
Fighting drugs makes it more dangerous. Fighting for safe use only makes it safer.
yeah, and yeah, and that's where the U.S. and its war on drugs has ultimately failed. I want to use another first world country as an example, Portugal. Portugal was in the late 1900s fighting much the same war on drugs as the US, but come the turn of the century, I believe it was 2001 or 2002, Portugal actually decriminalized all drugs. And with that, they saw a dramatic decline in the usage of drugs in general. And then the people that did use it were using it in a safer manner. They weren't being antisocial by using it anymore. They were just using it as either an escape, temporarily, or just a recreational activity.
Now,
Or in some
it does
cases, they
also
were
mean I'm
addicted.
guessing that the number of people that use drugs probably slightly increased.
No, it actually went down. The same thing was seen in Colorado, actually, with marijuana legalization. The number of, specifically, I know I saw a statistic for teenagers using marijuana went down after it was made legal, which arguably says, hey, this thing that you could only get in a back alley, it can now be bought by anyone over the age of 21 and
And
sold out like secondhand,
and
but
and
it's all
and,
vetted.
and I'm guessing that part of that is associated, particularly in the teenage community.
Hmm.
The reason for that is probably teenage rebellion, and if something is illegal, it makes it more tantalizing to the people with rebellious attitudes, which tend to more be teenagers. So I could see where making something no longer be an outlet for rebellious attitude, taking that rebellious aspect away, would lower the likelihood of people wanting to do it.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
I don't know how that would affect it in the adult population, though, because in the adult
Hmm.
population, if someone does something illegal, they're probably not doing it just because it's illegal. And so I'm thinking,
There's a reason, whether that be an escape or recreation. Those are usually the first two things that come to my mind, at least,
mhm,
when someone says I'm doing drugs, and I'm either like, is it recreational, or are they trying to escape from something,
sure. And
or are they addicted?
I would be very curious to see, based on the different age groups, how drug
Hmm.
use changed, and specifically, not just the amount, but the number of people that used drugs.
Yeah.
And my
So
guess is that in the younger population, it decreased, and in the older population, it would
in
increase.
whether or not the usage of it increased or decreased, the negative effects of drugs decreased substantially. Things like HIV infection, overdoses, I mean, just drug related crime in general went down astronomically following decriminalization. Um,
To to pull a quote from Star Wars, the more you tighten your grip, the more people will slip through your fingers.
mhm.
And
So to your
so,
grasp, I think, is the correct quote.
I'm paraphrasing, but you get the idea that if you try to crack down on something more and more, and you start fighting against
Mhm.
uh, basic instincts, and like particularly with addiction, you're fighting against someone's addiction, not them. It's a strong drive. It's I believe a similar part of the brain to wanting food. So it's like
Mhm.
if you're combating, you're standing between someone and food, and you think that chastising them or threatening them with jail time is going to stop them. No, if they want something, they will go out and get it. And
I mean,
you could
want or feel that they need it, because when you are
absolutely,
addicted to something, it is your
it's
brain
a
is
need.
saying, I need this.
Yes.
And you may be able to like think around that and say, do you really need this?
You,
But
you you may
it's a
consciously
constant
understand I
struggle.
don't need this, but
Yeah.
it doesn't matter if the more primitive sections of your brain are saying yes, you will get this.
Hmm.
And
So
so
yeah.
I think that there is definitely something to be said for if you loosen the grips
Hmm.
and you try to actually deal with it and help people manage it rather than forbid it. People will be more effective in using it, will be safer in using it, and people won't have to resort to
Yeah.
criminal acts in order to get it.
Yep. So just like circling back, just because I looked up the information. One, Portugal decriminalized in 2001. In the year 2000, HIV infection was over 104 per million
Okay.
each year, and then following that and following decriminalization in 2015, the new cases per million dropped to 4.2 per million. So from 104 to 4.2, and the data behind these has been studied and cited as the decriminalization being a major effect on it. It wasn't the only effect, but it wasn't the only thing causing the decrease, but it
Sure,
had a
but
major
that's
effect
still
there.
a 95% decrease approximately,
Right.
which
Yeah.
is
Or more than 95%.
right, which
Um,
is insane. That's a huge difference.
Yeah. So that's just goes to show that um, decriminalizing has a positive impact, whether or
It
not more
can
people
have
are
a
doing
positive.
it.
It can have a positive
Yeah,
impact. Now
I
that
should say
that being said,
it has.
there are
There is a yeah, it has had a positive impact
sure,
somewhere.
and let's take an example in the opposite direction. So
Mhm.
that's legalizing things. What about illegal illegalizing things? Let's look back to prohibition in the United States,
Mhm.
early 1900s.
Yeah.
All right, alcohol is completely illegal. Anyone with alcohol is going to be charged as a criminal. That did not work out well. That
Yeah.
was an amendment made to the Constitution. How long did that amendment last?
Only a couple of years, I think.
I believe it was less than a decade.
Yeah.
It was not very long. It was very quick that states realized, oh, this is not working out. This is just making more people resort to criminal acts. They're associating with gangs, and things became very violent because people will still want to get their booze. People would be making alcohol in their backyards, and they would be making it in less safe conditions. So
Mhm.
I
It
think
was
that
13 years, by the way, 1920 to 1933.
okay. So and alcohol is one of those drugs that's been around for thousands of years.
Hmm.
And it's something that people really like and they're not going to do without. And I think that
Yeah.
prohibition is a good example of outlawing drugs does not get rid of the problem, and yet we
Hmm.
still haven't learned from that because other drugs that haven't been as standardized as alcohol, we're still trying to have prohibition against them, and that's
Yeah.
not the solution. As is I think shown with alcohol, the solution is to make it legal but limit the effects that you can have on other people. Alcohol is
Yeah.
regulated in terms of where you can get it, when you can get it, how old you have to be in order
Hmm.
to get it, but
Yeah.
that's what makes
And
it slightly safer.
yeah, and also the thing about alcohol, though, I mean, it has a lot of negative impacts, but the education around it, I mean, growing up in the United States,
How do you do it
there were,
safely?
yeah, there were a lot of discussions of, well, once can drink alcohol legally, here's how you do it safely. Don't get behind the wheel. You can do this, you can do that. I never heard any sort of discussion like that about weed or anything like that. It's just
Mm-hmm.
like, don't do it. It's illegal.
So
Well,
now I how
what's
to do
yeah.
it how to have take drugs safely. I think that I mentioned that alcohol has certain danger factors, and
Hmm.
previously I said that's what made it safer in regards to criminality and being related to people who will go act against the government, sometimes in a violent way when trying to protect themselves or avoid being arrested for at that time legally serious crimes, which was having alcohol.
Hmm.
Um, Alcohol itself is incredibly dangerous when combined with a vehicle.
Oh yeah.
Drinking and
Or
driving is one
yeah.
of the lead causes of motor accidents and
Hmm.
has kills a large number of people every year.
Yep.
So I think we should probably start talking about how should people act or how should the government treat acts that have been done while under the influence of drugs, because it
I
sounds like
want
we're
to
on the
get to
same
that,
page.
but not
Yeah, go ahead.
yet. I want to add one more point about how government should treat the users of drugs and how it should be acting. So, using
uh
another example of another country, I want to just bring up drug clinics in the
sure.
Netherlands,
Okay.
specifically heroin clinics, and how they have done a good job in curbing the heroin epidemic. So, basically, if you're not familiar with these clinics, and
I'm not.
my information here is a few years old, so things may have changed. But the last I understood, the heroin clinics were available just about anywhere in the Netherlands. And if you were addicted to heroin, you could go to these clinics. And first and foremost, they would supply you with clean needles and syringes because uh, dirty
Which I
needles.
understand the argument against of what are you
Yeah.
talking about? You're trying to reduce heroin usage, so you're handing out clean needles. That's enabling.
So I mean, should we hand out condoms to teenagers, or should we say, nope, just don't have sex? Then everything's fine.
And
Yeah.
that's a good point. And there are people that have ideological differences in this section.
Hmm.
And I think that the condoms to teenagers is a good example. It's that some parents are realizing, kids are going to do it anyway. I'd rather have them be safe about it and not get pregnant rather than have them not do it at all. And
Right.
I think that you need to recognize the difference of forbidding something does not necessarily prevent someone from doing something. You
Yeah.
you should realize when something is a losing battle, and you need to help people do it safely. So I can understand that in if you're going to do heroin, you should do it safely. So sorry, go on.
Yeah. So that's the first thing that they do. In going when you go to one of these clinics, you aren't treated as a criminal. You are treated as a patient. You are someone with a disorder. I mean, you are addicted to a drug. Your brain has been wired to tell you constantly that you need this drug. And in some cases, I believe they actually have heroin available, like smaller doses, so that um, when someone goes there and they're like, I want to quit it, but I just cold turkey is really hard on the system. It's going to be terrible. I don't think
Sure.
I can
And
handle it.
and
They
my
will actually work with them to wean them off of heroin by giving them, a smaller amount over time.
Sure. And personally, I would like to see those types of organizations. I would want them to, while actually helping you through and taking a method that is effective, for instance, with weaning someone off of it, also make sure that, look, if you're going to use these resources, which I'm guessing are government provided resources,
Hmm.
you are now being a burden on society, or you're taking from society, and therefore you are now subject to certain types of regulation of, we're going to make sure that you aren't getting other forms of heroin elsewhere, because then you're
Hmm.
just cheating the system and you're getting heroin from us.
So, my understanding of how the Netherlands does it is they do not kind of push that. Instead, there's like, if you're going to do it, make sure you're doing it safely with clean needles and whatnot. Two, if you want to quit it, we will help you by helping you wean off of it. And then number three, if you go to one of these clinics, you are helped in those cases, but you're also given a lot of education about fighting addiction, fighting the urge that will be with you for the rest of your life. And then also distributing naloxone kits, which help with if you or someone near you is overdosing, a naloxone will save their life if it's on heroin or other opioids. Um, so, to my understanding, is that they don't
And
actively
and,
say
and I
we'll
think
help
that,
you as long as you promise never to touch heroin again from someone else.
no, and I'm not saying that they should say, oh well, you need to promise never to touch anything else. I'm saying that if you ask for help, you are actively saying, I want you to prevent me from doing this thing to myself, because
Hmm.
you are making the decision that I can't control these basic urges. I need that help. And so if you're asking for that help, you're giving up some of your autonomy of making decisions, because
Hmm.
because you're now being a burden in terms of getting some of those resources from, whether that be a healthcare organization or from a government organization. You're taking resources, and since you're being that burden, you are giving up some of your rights for that resource.
Hmm.
And I think that it's an important distinction between someone asking for help and forcing help on someone. Forcing
Hmm.
someone to say, no, we're going to put you through therapy to get you off these drugs, is very different than someone walking into those clinics and saying, I want help. But I think that if someone is asking for help, they're saying, do what it takes to get me off of this drug.
Hmm. I mean, to an extent, I will say
Uh,
that.
sure, we are not going to tie them to a table until they're done with their withdrawal symptoms. That would be
Mhm.
a form of cruel and unusual punishment. But I'm saying that finding a method that actually works in getting people off of their addiction, we need to find out how to get people off of these addictions. But if
Mhm.
they ask for help, or if they want assistance or want something provided from the government, we should provide it, assuming that they're willing to take the effort and give up some of their own decision making process specifically related to the drug use, so that they can actually get over it. Because if there's a method that will get you uh, over a particular addiction, you will need to follow that method, and you need to give up the rights that allow you to use that method.
Yeah.
There's a certain level of
I
subjugation, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair argument to be had.
Because if you're not, then you're just enabling the person to use more drugs. Now,
Mhm.
and the needles, I want to come back to that real quick, is that handing out clean needles and not giving out the drug is enabling a clean use. While, yes, that is a free resource, even if you haven't necessarily said, I want to get off of this, I want you to help me out with my addiction. If you are getting free needles, you're less likely to spread disease. and that lightens the burden on the healthcare system. So it's a cost, but it's a preventive measure that would otherwise be a burden on the society anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I understand your argument, and I think it's a fair thing to be brought up. I'm not entirely sure where I stand on it quite yet, but I don't think I need to submit a personal opinion there. I think it's worth just having it out in the open so that
Sure.
the listeners
Uh,
can
uh,
think through it themselves
and
and
it's
form their own
absolutely
opinion.
a good point. People that are actively asking for help should be helped.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you're asking for help, you need
Should
to
you be giving
you
something in return?
you need to be ready to the thing that you give in return may be the subjugation, that I need help and I want you to help me, and that means that I am giving you permission to do what's necessary to help me. And assuming that those methods have actually been shown to work, or that the people that those methods are being tested on have consented to that testing of like, look, we think that this medication may help get you over your addiction. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
look, if that's what it takes and you have to experiment on me because you don't know yet, okay, as long as people consent to that, I don't see a problem with it. But if people are asking for help, we should try to provide it while also making sure that we aren't just enabling them
Mm-hmm.
through some form of regulation, but assuming that they ask for it. We can't force it on them, because then they'll just resent you for it. And then even if they do get over the addiction, it's like, well, I didn't want to get over it. I want to go back to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because
I
you,
think that's a decision made by anyone providing that help is
yes.
what sort of promises does a person receiving that help need to give? And I mean, I
Because
can't think of.
you're fighting against two
Yeah.
portions of the brain. You're fighting against the conscious brain and the unconscious
Mm-hmm.
brain. And if you don't have either of those on your side, if the person doesn't want to get better and they're addicted, you're fighting against both parts of their brain. If the person
So
wants to get better, you're only fighting against the subconscious.
so what do you like? Do you think people? What's your opinion on giving consent when you're under the influence? Can you do it?
To an extent, yes. That if you are currently under the influence, so let's say turn away from cocaine and those types of things. Let's say alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
You get drunk and then you have sex, and you consented to sex only after you were drunk. Is that valid consent? In your opinion, is that valid consent?
There needs to be more context to
Okay.
it.
So
And when I say consent and asking about that, I am not only talking about sex. I know that's the most common thing, and that is a fair example because it's
I
one of
think
the
it's a
most
good
common. But
example because
if
it's
you
common.
can you sign a legally binding agreement when you are high off your balls?
That is a good question, and
That's really what I'm trying to ask here.
sure.
Because if you go to if you go to a clinic or rehabilitation or rehab or whatever to help to get you off it, you show up there in a very degraded mental state, whether that because you're actively on the drug or because you have your brain function has been degraded because of withdrawal or because of whatever situation. Can you go in there and make those promises at that point in time, or does that need to kind of come after the help once normal brain function has been restored?
So, are you okay with sticking with the sex consent? Because I think that that's similar, and it is
Sure.
something that can drastically affect your life if you end up getting
Yeah.
pregnant. So,
Or disease or
sure.
anything like that.
I've known people that if they're going out with people and they know that drinking is going to be involved, they have a discussion before any drinking is had saying, are you okay with sex while we are drunk or one of us is drunk? Are you okay with that? They ask that while the person is sober to get preemptive consent. And if that person says no, regardless of what they say while drunk, once that agreement has been made, they won't be having sex. That's a way of asking for consent. But I think more likely people will be drinking, then meet someone, then have sex.
Or in some cases, you meet someone, you are drinking with them, you like them, and you build that attraction that then could result in sex.
Sure.
So you don't always know whether or not if someone asks you first thing on a first date, hey, if you've been we've been drinking, would you be okay with having sex with me? I
Yep.
mean, I'm like, I don't know anything about you yet. We
Hmm.
literally
It wouldn't make
just
sense
met.
to preemptively ask for permission. So
Yeah.
I, what,
Certain
but
situations may make sense. I will just
sure.
not, I'm just saying
I would
not
say,
all
I would
situations.
say if you are drunk, yes, you can consent because you know, or at least you should know, that alcohol lowers your inhibitions and changes your decision making. The fact that you got drunk in an area that you may end up meeting someone and having sex, and you got drunk to the point of being willing to have sex with someone, means that you have consented to your decisions, not necessarily the sex, but you've consented to the decisions made because you put yourself into that position. As an example, the first time that I got drunk, and actually the only time that I've gotten drunk, was in a controlled circumstance. I surrounded myself with people that I knew. Some of them were not drinking to make sure that I didn't do anything that I would later regret because I wanted to experience what it's like being drunk without doing anything dumb or that I would regret. I knew what that my decision making would probably be hampered while I was drunk, and so I went into it actively and preemptively trying to avoid bad decisions. If people are drinking, they are actively making the choice to put themselves in a position where they lose the ability to make good decisions. And if they put themselves into that position, they are responsible for their own actions and their own choices that were made during that state because they chose to be in that state.
Yeah. I mean, that's how the law sees it
Not in all
in
places.
general.
I believe
Well,
it's not necessarily in all places.
if you get behind the wheel while drunk, whether
I'm saying
you were in an altered
sex
state
while
of mind,
drunk.
sex while drunk, yeah, I'm just saying in general, the argument of if you do something while drunk, you are still responsible for what you did.
And I agree with that. And I think that that's something that should be taken into account for drugs in general. Again, we've been largely saying that you need to fight the negative effects of drugs rather than the drugs themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll make a proposition for you, because let's say we legalize all drugs.
Mm-hmm.
That'll be a great title for this. If we legalize all drugs, every single one, no matter how bad the negative effects are on the particular person.
Legalize, decriminalize, and
No,
then at which
completely
point
legalize
the
that.
usage and distribution of it by
Everything,
anyone?
everything. Anyone can do, like, there are, if you're going to be selling it in massive amounts, like at a grocery store, then there'll be Food and Drug Administration regulations on it. But it's unregulated. It's taxed, but it's like any other food.
So it's regulated.
It is
It's
it is
taxed.
regulated as much as food.
Yeah.
Okay,
And
so equivalent
yep.
to food.
Okay.
That's what I
All
mean
right.
by legalizing.
Okay. Yeah. So it becomes caffeine. Every drug is
Yes.
treated like caffeine.
Let's say that every drug is treated like caffeine or like food in general. And that
Yeah.
includes alcohol, which means that alcohol, you're no longer prohibited based on your age. Okay, that level of legalization.
Okay.
However, and maybe have some clinics set up for helping with addiction problems and some of the negative effects that you will end up having to pay for or contribute towards if you use, just like medical facilities that we have right now. But if you commit a crime while you under the influence of a particular type of drug that is associated with the effects of that drug, you are more responsible for the negative effects of those actions. And a good example of this, cocaine. I was mentioning earlier that it decreases your inhibitions, and it's a stimulant, meaning that you are more likely to act on feelings that would otherwise be inhibited. And this mostly shows itself in the form of violence, that you're more likely to act on violent tendencies, whether that be rape, assault.
Violent. I'm going to say more aggressive tendencies.
More aggressive tendencies. Fine. So assault is more common if you're on cocaine versus off cocaine. And the same thing goes for alcohol, because in many stories when you hear about people being abusive, it tends to be associated with drinking. The person is abusive in general, but they're more likely to act on it when drinking. If you then substitute cocaine in because it's an upper, they're even more likely to act on it. So I would say that if all drugs are legal to the point of being regulated the same as food, but someone commits a crime, for instance, while high on cocaine, that is associated with the mental changes that cocaine does. In other words, cocaine will make you more likely to perform assault and battery against someone. If you perform assault and battery against someone while high on cocaine, since you intentionally made the decision while sober to get high on cocaine and put yourself into a position where you're more likely to commit that crime, I would say it would be similar to the difference between committing a crime and committing a crime with plan. So murder is prosecuted differently than murder with intent. And I think that if we treat drugs the same way, that you committed an act, okay, but you weren't high. You committed an act while high on a drug that made you more likely to commit that act. That is that act with intent, and increase, not necessarily at the 100 to 1, but let's say assault and battery has a fine associated with it. Let's say you get a year in prison for a particular type of assault and battery. If you performed the same exact crime while high on cocaine, because you made the active, sober decision to put yourself into a position that made you more likely to do that, then it would be 5 times the penalty. So instead of 1 year, you get 5 years. Something along those lines. So regardless of what it is, the penalty is increased if you've made the choice to put yourself in the position that increases your likelihood of committing a crime.
Yeah. And I believe that's kind of, in some regards, alcohol is treated like that. I don't have the specific example.
Getting into a car accident will not have the same negative side effects as getting into a car accident while drunk.
So not even while drunk. You can, if you have alcohol in your system and be below the legal limit to drive with alcohol, I believe the way that you are prosecuted and the way that I guess most juries or judges would sentence you and do all that, if there is any alcohol in your system, let's say the legal limit, I think right now is 0.07 or something like that.
0.08.
0.08. Okay. Then let's say you are 0.06 and you get behind the wheel of a car, and in the process you end up crashing and causing damage to someone else or someone's property or whatever it is. If when it goes to court and whatnot, the fact that you had alcohol in your system will be brought up and will work actively against you, even though you were within the legal limit.
And I think that's similar to what I was suggesting, is that regardless of how much you have, that I think that having drugs in your system should change the amount of penalty. The amount of drugs that you have in your system should also change how much that penalty is magnified. If you have a blood alcohol level of 0.4, which is at the lethal limit for most people, you have made the decision and repeated decisions to get to that point, and your inhibitions are seriously inhibited. Your ability to make decisions rationally is seriously inhibited. So you should be much more penalized than if you did the same action at a 0.02.
Yeah.
Because, in other words, the likelihood of the drug being the dominant factor in a person's commission of a crime should have a direct impact on the severity of the penalty.
Determination of guilt in some cases.
And determination of guilt. And I think that would be much more effective than just outlawing all drugs, because you're letting people know, hey, we're serious about this. If you take this drug, you are more likely to have problems with these particular acts. And if you commit these acts, we are going to bring the hammer down. That's how you make sure that people use drugs safely, is not criminalize the use, criminalize the abuse and the acts that are done while high on them, and be ruthless on it. I'm not saying kill people on it, but I'm saying that make sure that people understand that you are serious about using drugs responsibly, and that's how you can, I think, have serious drug reform.
Yeah.
And so also giving people a way out.
Yeah. Where do you stand on thing like being under the influence of something, but let's say it's a legal drug that you are prescribed. You are prescribed a new drug and you take it, and I mean, they always say with anything that could affect it, you say like
Hmm.
make sure you understand the effects on you before you get behind the wheel of a car, because prescription drugs can
Like
have similar
melatonin.
effects. Sure. Yeah.
Melatonin is the chemical that your brain automatically produces to make you sleepy.
Yeah.
It's a sleep aid.
Yep. And so let's say you get prescribed melatonin and you start taking it and you feel like you can drive even after you've taken a single dose of it,
Hmm.
whatever that amount may be.
Yep.
And
You've ignored the listed side effects, and you should be penalized for that ignorance should you end up
no,
committing a crime.
well, let me finish my example, because that's not the end of the story before
Okay.
whatever happens. So you take melatonin, you have done what most people would consider a reasonable amount of effort put in to say, yes, I'm still good to drive after one pill or one dose or whatever. And in the process of doing that, you've like, let's say you got to dinner and you've had one pill and you drink one glass of alcohol, and your body, with the combination of even the smallest amount of alcohol and the melatonin, drastically increases the effects, and you get
Yep.
behind the wheel.
Yep.
What is your standing on that? Is it reasonable that every person taking any drug has tested every combination with anything else before getting behind the wheel?
So this is the reason that drugs have a lot of labels on them and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
warnings. And if you can't understand and memorize the labels and understand the potential effects, you are consenting by even if you skip reading them, you are consenting to the acts that you end up committing by not reading them. Melatonin and alcohol is a great example of that. That when you combine them, and it says, do not combine with alcohol on melatonin
Mm-hmm.
bottles. So it
Yeah.
gives you those warnings. If you actively ignore those, you are taking responsibility for your future actions. And I think that that's the best way to move forward. Is people are responsible for their own actions.
Mm-hmm. So what if it's a side effect? Like, let's say that the effect of melatonin and alcohol was unknown, and
Then they are not
it's
responsible
not
for it.
related.
It
Okay.
this is something that's used all over the place. That if there's a particular, not even a drug, but objects. I think I remember hearing a story of a ladder company. They sent a ladder. They sold ladders. A guy put the ladder somewhere in his barn. It ended up being on some frozen manure,
Mm-hmm.
and as he was on the ladder, the frozen manure thawed out during the day. Ladder fell over, and he broke his arm. He sued the ladder company, and he won because there were no labels saying what type of surface the ladder needed to be on, which is why you see so many labels of like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
don't put the ladder like this. Put the ladder like this. Make sure it's at the proper angle. That's why you see labels on so many things, and that's where the regulation comes in, is making sure that people understand, here's what you have to do to use this thing safely. And
Mm-hmm.
what I guess what the case that I'm making is that if there is something, if there's a drug that has known effects, it should be on the container that drug is sold in. Those
Mm-hmm.
warnings should be there. And if you disregard those warnings, or if those warnings are on there, then the drug and the drug company is no longer responsible for the actions taken. If the warning is there, the person that's using it is the one responsible. And that is recognized, at least in terms of mechanical things and people misusing tools. If the warnings are there, the person using it is responsible. And I think that we should do the same exact thing for drugs,
Okay.
that have warnings and have as many things as you can there of look, don't combine it with this. Don't combine it with this. Be safe about it. Here are the possible reactions that you can have on the container that sells it, or on what contains it. Like any other medicine or drug, it mentions the side effects and how not to use it. It has it in directions for use and warnings. By ignoring those, and this is a well-established thing in basically anything that's legal and has dangers to
Mm-hmm.
it, it's well established that those warnings are there to make sure that the responsibility is on the person using it. And if you aren't smart enough to understand those,
Mm-hmm.
and you still use it anyway, you have now subjugated yourself to the law.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, there is a certain point where, I mean, it shouldn't be on the drug companies to test every combination of every of
And they should
this new
try.
drug with every other possible drug. I mean, the most common ones, and then have a general statement of be before
You
combining with,
combine this with other drugs at your own risk.
yeah, or like before combining, or before, like, if you are going to be taking this with another drug that we haven't explicitly stated, you are responsible for understanding the effects and
Sure.
responsible for any
And
actions taken or crimes committed while under
and,
a said combination.
and melatonin is a great example of that, because they say know how you act after taking this, because a lot of those are intended for an 8-hour sleep. And some
Hmm.
people may be affected differently, and it may make them tired for 12 hours. So if you're going to start taking melatonin, one of the things it says on the bottle is don't take this, don't operate heavy machinery or vehicles until
Hmm.
you know how this affects you. So if you decide, hey, it's a Sunday night, I'm going to take melatonin for the first time right now, 8 hours before I have to wake up, that's a bad idea, and it goes against the warnings on the label. So you have a broad warning that covers a lot, and when people act against that, that means that it's their responsibility. And again, going back to the original point with consent and responsibility, is that if you take a drug, you are consenting to the things that you do while on the drug, and that's it. The
Hmm.
involvement of labels and warnings should make sure that give people the best possible chance of understanding the risks that they're putting themselves and others in those circumstances.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Now, I think let's add on a different section of drug discussion, and that is drugs that are used in a negative way by default, or tend to be. And the specific one that I'm thinking of is the date rape drug.
Hmm.
It's a particular chemical that ends up putting you to sleep and makes it basically you don't wake up from it for a set amount of time. You pass
Or you
out,
don't remember anything that
or
happened during
sure. So, and the reason it's used as or named the date rape drug is because people will frequently slip it into someone's drink. That person
it.
will
Hmm.
ingest the drink, end up getting drowsy, pass out, and then that person can just be carried away and raped because they're
Yeah, it's fair to
unconscious.
say that it isn't any single drug. There are multiple drugs that are used as this.
Sure.
There are some more common ones that, like
And
would
alcohol to
be.
some degree is
Yeah.
like that, because you can say, oh well, why don't you have a few drinks? I'll just have another drink, and you can get someone drunk to the point where they're more likely to um, perform acts or have sex with you. And so convincing someone to have alcohol
Hmm.
is similar, but that it does require sober consent to have alcohol and put themselves in that position. And so they are abdicating their responsibility, or they are saying, yeah, I am responsible for my decisions because I was making the initial decisions as I was sober. The date rape drug is different, or drugs that are slipped into drinks or ingested involuntarily is different, but I
Hmm.
don't think it should be prosecuted as drugs specifically. I think it should be prosecuted as a crime with intent and planning. That it,
Yeah.
I would say if you drug someone and you have sex with them, I would say that's somewhat equivalent to tying them up while they're conscious and raping them, because
Yeah.
you are forcing them into a position that they did not consent to.
Hmm. So if someone slips you a date rape drug, you get behind the wheel of a car because you didn't know it's in your system, and it kicks in while you are driving, and you end up crashing and causing harm to someone, something, or yourself.
Yep.
Um, how do you think that should be prosecuted? I mean, you may not ever be able to tell who uh gave that date rape drug to the person, but should it just be kind of dropped and said, well, the two people involved in the actual accident, neither of them were to blame. This unknown quantity prior to the fact was to blame, but we can't really prosecute them because we don't know who it was.
That's a good question. That if someone involuntarily ingests something and then performs an action that is illegal or would otherwise be prosecutable, how should they be prosecuted with relation to the increased sentencing of the drug?
Hmm.
That's a good question. I I want to come back to that really quick. I want to make sure that we have a consensus on the previous point, which was
Yeah.
the date rape drug and using it to get a person using a drug on another person to perform certain actions, that any actions committed there should be considered planned
Hmm.
and of much higher severity. That, oh, you used a drug
Yeah.
to end up having sex with this person. Not only are we going to charge you with rape, we're going to charge you with the planning for that rape. And it would be
Yeah.
similar to murder versus murder with intent.
Yeah. Yeah. Premeditated rape versus, I guess, in the moment rape, or like premeditated murder versus in the
Right.
moment
And
murder.
and and
Um,
and not just premeditated, but premeditated with other actions taken to make sure that you were successful with it. So, you know,
well, that's kind of what premeditation goes into, is like
premedit
you plan, you're making a plan for it.
yes, but what I'm saying is that there's a difference between premeditation as I went to this bar intending to rape someone versus I went to this bar with materials that would facilitate me being able to rape someone. I'm saying that
Yeah.
those two should be distinct, and coming with the materials that make it more likely for you to be successful in that crime, the
Mhm.
the more effective the material, the harder the sentencing should be.
Yeah.
And so I think that, and that's for any drug that is used for nefarious purposes, not just the date rape drug, but I think that's a pretty clear cut example. It's any drug that's used involuntarily on a person for nefarious purposes should drastically magnify and multiply the negative penalties for that same action. And then, so
Mhm.
are we in agreement with that?
Yeah. I definitely think people should be prosecuted for like using date rape drugs on another person
And
beyond
more
just
heavily
the
than
rape
just the,
charge.
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
All right. So then the other question that you posed was, what about someone who has had drugs involuntarily used on them and
Hmm.
then they commit an act that the drug makes more likely?
Yeah.
My initial thought would be the person should not be held responsible for it because they didn't consent to it. That
Hmm.
being said, who d that if you hold the person responsible for it, then that can be unfair because it wasn't their fault. If you don't
Hmm.
hold the person responsible for it, you should try to find who can be prosecuted for it. If you fail to find who's prosecuted for it, you end up prosecuting no one.
Hmm.
But it's but if the person that did the action while involuntarily under the influence of that drug, they didn't consent to it, it's not their fault. They aren't responsible for it, and it's better to let that
Hmm.
innocent person go free and the criminal go free than to prosecute the innocent person as a criminal. And that's something that, at least in the United States justice system, it's based on preferring to let 10 criminals go free rather than condemn one innocent person. And
Yeah.
I think that the same thing would have to follow for this, is that you take the side of the innocent, that, look, you ended up committing this act, but it was not because you consented to the drugs. Again, back to what we were saying with legalization of drugs, is that by taking them and knowing that you're taking them, you are consenting to your actions. If you don't know that you're taking them, you're not consenting to your actions. And so you're no
Mm.
longer responsible for it. The person that is responsible is the person that ended up in forcing you to have those drugs. And that does mean that sometimes they will not be prosecuted. Now, that also opens the door for abuse in terms of,
Yeah.
oh, I'm drunk. I really don't want, and I know that it's not safe for me to go home. I'm going to take a date rape drug intentionally, and it won't take effect for the time that it takes me to get home. And then if I do get into an accident on the way home, I can just say that, it'll show up that I was drugged involuntarily, and then I'm not
Hmm.
responsible for it. So
Yeah.
there are methods of
So,
abuse.
yeah, or something along the lines of, I swear I didn't know there was alcohol in this thing I ordered. I said virgin, and the bartender obviously just didn't hear me or misunderstood and
In
gave
which
me
case, the
something with
bartender
alcohol
would
in
be
it.
responsible for the actions.
But if whether or not that's true, whether the person at the bar had said, "Give me a virgin, whatever drink, like a virgin mojito,"
Mm-hmm.
and they like whether or not, like, let's say someone goes to the bar and says, "I'll have a mojito," and the bartender gives them one, and then that person goes and after a couple of those gets behind the wheel and crash and says, "No, I swear, every time I said mojito, I said virgin mojito, but the bartender never actually heard me."
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the abuse that first came to my mind is
Sure.
you can then lie and say, "No, I
And,
swear this wasn't
and I think
something
that
that
that's
I
something
meant to
that
do."
would probably need to be handled on a case by case basis and eventually work its way through the courts in making those decisions.
Hmm.
Is that if a person does that once, okay, maybe we will have to abdicate assignment of responsibility right now because we can't verify it. If the person does the same thing again,
Hmm.
fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Hmm.
And I think that there may be a strike system or something along the lines of, but then you could just always use that excuse. And it would probably end up being something along the lines of verification that you are consenting to a particular thing. So, for instance, always IDing someone means that they are going to be giving you alcohol.
Hmm.
So, I would say some sort of verification and standardization that, hey, you are putting yourself at this risk. You need to understand that, and making that standard avoids some of these problems. And it doesn't avoid the problem of involuntary drugs in terms of it with intention behind it, like the date rape drug. I feel like while you could abuse that system of, I know that I'm going to be driving drunk, I'm just going to take the date rape drug for plausible deniability. Yeah, it can be abused. I highly doubt that people will be using that regularly. Also, one of the things that you can help with that is in some cases, particularly for drugs that can be used for nefarious purposes, as much as I hate to say it, have a method of tracking those chemicals. So having it be a controlled substance, not a controlled substance in the sense that you can't get it. Make sure that it's in some way tracked. And I think that I want to draw a comparison to firearms here.
Hmm.
In the United States, there is no firearm registry. You don't know what firearm belongs to what person, how many guns a person has, but there is a background check associated with it. That whenever you go to any gun store in the United States and you want to purchase a firearm, a federal background check is run on that person. And it shows up that that background check was run. I think that a similar thing could be done for drugs that are frequently used in a negative way. Date rape drug is a great example of that. That if you sell it, and maybe there are reasons for it, like, hey, I need a sleep aid. Okay. This is a really powerful sleep aid. It can also be
Hmm.
used and has been used in facilitating rape. We're not going to make it illegal, but if you purchase this, it's a controlled substance. We will know that you ended up making this purchase at some point. So if you purchase a bunch and then you end up having it in your own system and you make the excuse of, oh, I didn't know it was there, I think that you should be more likely to be prosecuted. So with legality and making all drugs legal, like I said earlier, of making them legal to the point of being like food, for things that have been used for nefarious purposes and are frequently used specifically for nefarious purposes, not just they may result in you acting nefariously, that you use them to act nefariously with that intent, nefarious intent, that
Hmm.
that should have some sort of government regulation or tracking of those chemicals. Just
Yeah.
similar to potassium nitrate, which is used in explosives. Like, you can get it, but generally you have to show that there's a reason, like what reason you have to get it. And if you are buying large amounts, the government is aware of you buying large amounts. It's not forbidden, but it's more tracked because of the potential dangers of that substance.
Hmm.
Does that seem reasonable in a way of preventing people from abusing the system?
Yeah, I think I followed what you said, and I think so.
Because I agree that we need to be careful of how drugs are used on other people
Hmm.
involuntarily. We also need to be careful of how they're used voluntarily and specifically how that affects other people. I think another thing that we should probably... So are you okay with moving on?
Yeah.
Okay, because there's one other thing that I wanted to hit on, which is, I guess, the opioid epidemic, where you don't really affect other people, but you're affecting yourself. That when you're taking opioids, which are basically very powerful painkillers, and they put you into a euphoric state where you don't really have negative sensations. It's very, very addictive, and it ends up putting yourself into a position where you're risking your life. You can overdose on them, and that's something that police frequently have to deal with in the United States in particular. Police will get calls of someone overdosing on opioids, and if left, they will die. And if not, then you use Narcan on the person, which will prevent them from overdosing. To an extent, I think that repeatedly using Narcan, and I've known police officers and talked to them about this, for people that are opioid abusers, they are more... If you're going to use Narcan to save someone's life, it's very likely that you will end up using it on the same person multiple times. And
so is that I guess, is it enough to simply save their life, and do you expect that that's going to be enough for them to stop? Or should it be, if there is no other education, no other assistance to kick the habit, is that really a fair point, though? That if it's continued use, it really says this person is not getting the help that they need, and the threat of their own life is not enough for them to stop right now.
So I would say if the threat of your own life is not enough to make you stop, that you will continue using opioids, and even if it's not a conscious decision, it's a subconscious drive of, I need to have these opioids. If you are to the point where you're overdosing multiple times, and that's the key, multiple times you've overdosed and people have had to come out, use Narcan to save your life. I think that in those cases, other measures should be taken. I'm not saying that you shouldn't save the person's life. I'm saying that by saving their life multiple times, they are starting to abdicate their own decision-making abilities related to their lives. Not that their life belongs to the state, but I think that at some point, you should say to them, we will no longer use Narcan for you unless you are actively going to rehab. So make sure that, look, you have shown multiple times that you cannot use this responsibly, and while you're not affecting other people in a negative way directly, you're not beating someone up, you are not treating yourself in a way that is conducive to you living. And so I think at some point, while they're sober, you need to sit them down and say, you have a choice. Either, number one, we will no longer save your life in a life-threatening circumstance. If you're overdosing, we will let you die. Or you can go to rehab, start regularly checking in, and make sure that you are trying to kick this habit because you've shown that you can't maintain the responsibility necessary for it. And then if you do start overdosing while going to rehab and meeting the rules there, then we will save your life because you're trying to get better. And I realize that you're in a way selling your soul in that sense of, but constantly saving someone's life when they're constantly putting themselves into that position is not fair. They are making the decision and repeatedly making the decision to risk their own life. And once they come out of it, they know where they're at. There are a couple of reactions that people have when coming out of opioid highs. And because the Narcan just completely eliminates your high. The high is gone. And sometimes they'll be sad. Sometimes they'll be sadness is one of them, of like, oh man, I'm no longer high. Another one frequently is anger, rage, because a lot of times it's several $1,000s that they spent and their high is completely gone. So while they were going to die, and the person that just gave them Narcan saved their life, one of the frequent responses is rage, as in them yelling, I'm going to kill you for taking away my high, which is one of the reasons that a standard procedure is while the person is unconscious, before you give them Narcan, you cuff them and prevent them from moving and make sure that they don't have any weapons on them. Because there have been instances of police officers saving someone's life by giving them Narcan and then being stabbed by the person because the person was upset that their high was stolen. And that's why I say if you are to the point where you are dying, multiple times people have had to save your life and you don't agree to try and kick the habit, you are actively choosing while sober to take responsibility for your own life, and that may mean that we need to let some people die in those circumstances. I realize that's really, really dark, but I think it's the logical thing to do, and it allows people to soberly make the choice of what circumstances they put themselves into.
Yeah, I do agree with I do see the logic in what you're saying. There is a part of me that just says human life is almost is I will say
Inherently valuable.
inherently valuable, and when it given in terms of money or societal impact is it I feel like a lot of people would try to say um,
In
priceless,
yeah,
but it's hard to define the value of a human life,
yep.
and
And I may
yeah.
that would maybe be a topic that we can eventually try and tackle on a future podcast. But
Mm,
I think allowing people their own choices to make their own choices is something very important. And this is an example of if people are to the point where they are putting themselves at risk of death, you can't say, or people shouldn't say, no, you're not allowed to do those things that put yourself at risk. All we can say is, you're putting yourself at risk. You're likely
mm,
going to die. And if they still consent to that and still act on it and end up dying because of it, it's not another person's responsibility to save your life after you've repeatedly shown the inability to be responsible for that. Someone bungee jumping and knowing that their life was at risk, you're still going to end up sending them to the hospital and trying to help cure them and repair injuries if something goes wrong.
mm.
But if they keep getting injured and keep getting injured, and you say to them, look, you can't pay for this, you are not paying for the burden that you're putting on the healthcare system, this is your responsibility. At some point, you have to stop. At least I think at some point you have to stop.
Yeah.
And that means that at some point you have to put a value on a human life, or more specifically, a value on how much freedom of choice do we allow to people. And I think
Yeah.
that's a more important distinction, that we're not saying your life is not worth what's in this container of Narcan. It's saying
Mm.
you have the right to choose, but not at the expense of others.
Yeah. And I do like that distinction there of having their choice, but not at others' expense. Um, that is, like, yeah,
It it
and
it, it and I think that's more of an ethical question than
yeah,
necessarily
and
the
that's
a
that's
logical.
where I'm hitting the roadblock. I'm like, I agree with the logic, the ethics, though I
I,
am
I agree,
unsure about,
and I
and
think
I'll let people form their own opinions there. It's,
I think that this is probably a good point to leave off, because
so
we've
actually,
gone.
I've got one more
Yeah,
thing.
go ahead.
Um, so a lot of the opioid epidemic, as it is, stems from these large pharmaceutical companies pushing doctors to prescribe excessive amounts of opioid for a lot of things that wouldn't may otherwise not be needed,
Yep.
and that has led to the opioid epidemic, is the over prescription of these opioids
Yep.
thanks to these pharmaceutical companies.
In which
So
case, the pharmaceutical companies should be prosecuted by pushing something with known negative effects, and the upper echelons of those pharmaceutical companies that were making those pushes should be held responsible for the negative effects and cost associated with the drug users. That because there are known negative effects and known addiction rates, if you're pushing for something that ends up surpassing those addiction rates and causing massive epidemic problems, the companies responsible for those initial pushes should be held monetarily responsible for those actions.
just monetarily.
uh, Monetarily, and if deaths are associated with it, of people overdosing, then you should look at some sort of relation of selling unsafe products that end up leading to death. In which case, the people that were designing the products and pushing the products in those ending up lethal amounts should be held responsible.
Mm. Okay, that was my main question. Is uh, uh, it is
It's going to be harder to prosecute, similarly to someone using a date rape drug on another person, and then that person ends up committing a crime or going into an accident because they were extra sleepy. It's going to be harder to prosecute, but the penalties for that prosecution should be significantly higher. And I think that it is something that we should try to prosecute in the form of dealing with drug companies that have overprescribed despite knowing the risks involved.
Well, pushed doctors to overprescribe.
Yes, and I don't think that the doctors should necessarily be the ones responsible for it. Assuming that there is a push for, hey, you know, this is something that really works. You should really prescribe more of this. If that ends up leading to negative consequences, the companies that were making the recommendations to push in greater amounts should be held responsible.
Yeah. Okay.
So
I would agree with that.
So we covered quite a few aspects here, and I think we covered a lot, but I think we really got down to it. Sometimes it's an ideological thing, but in the end, you should allow people to make as many decisions as possible on their own. But if they make those decisions, you should hold them responsible for the decisions made, or the decisions made under the influence of something that they made the decision to take. And I realize that that was kind of a nebulous statement there, but if you make the sober decision to take a drug and there are warning labels on that drug, there are known side effects, you abdicate that company's responsibility for your actions by reading through the warning labels. You are taking responsibility for any actions taken on a drug. And I think that that's how it should be legally treated, is that any drug should be treated just like any other food or current legal drug, that sometimes regulated when they're used specifically for nefarious purposes and somewhat tracked, but still allow people access, try to help them when they have trouble with the access, and reduce the negative side effects rather than completely try to stop drug use altogether. I think that's I'm trying to spend 30 seconds just summarizing the past 2 hours of discussion that we had. So I think we hit all the critical points. Yeah. And if we missed something, let us know down in the comments. We're happy to have discussions there. And if we have enough topics, we may add an addendum to the episode to lengthen it out a little bit. So,
definitely. And if anything, I pulled a lot of things from memory. So if there's any facts that I got wrong about things that I said about examples of other countries, I'd like to hear them. I mean, just do it in a civil way. No one's got a perfect memory. I certainly don't. So if I said something
and if you talk about personal experience, keep in mind that don't say that you've done anything illegal, and don't do anything illegal. Don't do anything that puts anyone else or yourself at risk. Be safe, and again, be respectful in the comments. So, anything else you want to add?
No, not right now.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.